which is good. I'm quite happy with that. And this brings me into the first of the two topics that I'm going to cover today, which is about normalization of deviance or normalization of risk, which is a new way of looking at it. Now, in the A to Z, Guy Shockey gives lost, and Diane Vaughan wrote her book called Challenger Launch Decision and looked at how the organization gradually drifted from what was considered acceptable standards to a very catastrophic outcome. And you could almost say that it was risk managed right up until the point that Challenger exploded. And unfortunately, the organization, NASA and the US government, did not learn from this, and they lost Columbia a number of years later. And after that, they fundamentally shifted how they look at risk. And normalization of deviance is this social construct that says that we will accept small steps, and we don't even notice those steps are taking place. So we start off with a baseline, and that's the standard. And that's what the training agencies believe you are taught, because instructors will drift as well, and they will start deviating from what the standards are unless there is some cross-check that happens. So you start with this baseline standard, and then because there is always a trade-off between efficiency and thoroughness, you will find a better way or a quicker way or a more efficient way of doing something, and you create a new standard in your head, within your team, within your dive center, that says this is the new rule. So we go from here to this rule here. Now we sit here and we operate against this standard for a while, and there might be commercial pressures, there might be time pressures, there might be this want to get more photos or videos or whatever, and we gradually move from that baseline to a new one, and we set that up. And now this becomes our baseline. And this carries on, and we set these new baselines and they become acceptable. And because we are social creatures, we want to be socially conformed. If we don't want to challenge that, it becomes very difficult for people to question the fact that the standard has drifted. And we end up with another standard, and it's another standard. And then when we have an accident or an incident or a serious near miss, and people shine the spotlight on the situation, what we have then is people go, how could you go from this standard, which is the one that's written, to where you were operating here? That's a huge delta. How could you go and not see how far you were in operating in safety? Now, the problem is that's not how our brains work, because what was happening is you're managing little deltas, a little delta, a little delta, a little delta, change, a delta. And each time, what you're doing is you're adding things onto what's happening, and you don't realize how much you are eroding the safety margins. So this normalization of deviance is normal human behavior, because what we're trying to do is challenge and offset the goals and things that we're having to deal with. And I'll come on to that in my next letter that we're going to look at the difference between work as imagined and work as done. Now, another way of looking at this normalization of deviance is actually calling it normalization of risk. And this is slightly different to something called risk homeostasis. Now, the idea of this normalization of risk is that as divers, we're managing that risk all the time. We know what the safety margins are or should be, and we develop our training, our diving, our protocols based on risk management, making sure that we don't end up with an adverse outcome. So you could say that this is my risk baseline. This is what I consider safe. But as I become more experienced, I become more knowledgeable, I understand how things work as opposed to what they should be done, the sort of paperwork version versus the operational version. And I start to change the risk boundaries, what I perceive to be risky, what I perceive to be, or what I accept as being risky, and how I manage that. And that could be through increasing my equipment, my redundancy, my teammates, the competencies we have. All the time we're shifting from a baseline risk where we may not really appreciate the hazards that are out there and the likelihoods. And we start gaining additional skills to allow us to get greater risk exposures. And that could be end up as being, a couple of kilometers back in a cave system, or 80 meters down on a wreck, or tens of meters, 50 meters or so inside a wreck lining off. And each time we're managing that risk, and we're doing it subconsciously. And that subconscious means that often we're using cognitive biases, and there's a number that stop us learning from how close we are to a failure point. And those could be outcome bias. Well, we didn't have something go wrong, therefore it must have been okay. And that's such a common phrase, because that's how our brains work. Another one is severity bias. We could look at this and say, well, it wasn't a very severe outcome, therefore it must have been okay. And we don't look at the triggers or the context or the situation that led to it. As an example, you could say that a diver who runs out of gas and dies, we would treat that situation quite severely, because you'd sit there and go, really? They ran out of gas on that dive? They weren't paying attention. What was going on? And we become quite judgmental. We could then look at another almost exactly the same situation where somebody runs out of gas, but they don't die. So they get to the surface, and people are going to go, oh, that wasn't very good. And there might be some criticism, but it won't be as severe as if somebody died. If we have somebody who runs out, or they don't run out completely, they end up with well below what the minimums were. So instead of being on the surface, we say 30 or 40 bar, they end up with 10 or 20 bar. And we might go, yeah, okay, we might look at that. In fact, in some places, we might actually congratulate them because they've got a longer dive. And I've heard numerous stories from dive boat operators who turn around and go, what do you mean you've got gas less in your cylinder? That's gas that you can't use, and you've missed out on part of your dive. And there's this recognition that what's left in your cylinder is a margin, and it's fit to get you and your buddy from the depths to the surface. And then we could end up having somebody who just ends up a little bit below margins, and they're on the surface. And each time we reduce the severity, we become less judgmental of the situation. So that's what the severity bias is. Now, in each case, the causes might be the same: being distracted or having your attention taken somewhere else. It could be about poor planning. It could be about increased task loading. And what we have to do is separate the outcome from the decision-making processes that were involved, because we can't change outcomes. What we can do is we can change things that lead to outcomes. Because if we turn around and say, don't run out of gas, yeah, okay, I know not to run out of gas. What I have to look at is, how did it make sense for me to run out of gas? So that's really what this bit about normalization of deviance and normalization of risk is, this bit that we shift from a standard, a baseline, and then over time, because things are eroding our safety margins, we end up with a more risky situation, but we don't know how close we are to that risk failure point until something adverse occurs. Now, what I'm going to talk about now as the second little video bit, before then going into playing the N to Z, the second half of A to Z, I'm going to talk about something called organizational drift, and looking at these concepts of work as imagined and work as done. And they're quite similar to what we just described as normalization of deviance. And that's intentional, because I want to reinforce these points that it is normal to drift. It is normal to deviate. It is normal to normalize the risk, because we're trying to get those goals done. So if I look at this, these slides here, and I gave this presentation, this is 3 slides from the Human Factors and Diving Conference that that I ran 2 weeks ago today, actually, the 24th and 25th of September. And my presentation was entitled The Messy World of Diving. And there were a number of slides before this that sort of set the scene. But this is really a concept of organizational drift, that actually it's not just individuals, that organizations drift as well. So the concept here is that we've got 2 axes on any graph, as you would do: time as it progresses, and the vertical axis is this sort of concept of safety, or how we do stuff around here, the sort of culture, and how we create safe situations, how we manage risk. Now, in many organizations, we have something called work as imagined or work as prescribed. Now, work as imagined is this idea of codifying the ideas that to make things safe. And those could be rule books, procedures, processes, guidelines, checklists, all of these things. And as an organization and the leadership of an organization, we believe that as long as people follow this work as imagined, work as prescribed, imagined is my idea of what it should be, prescribed is that being codified in the books and things, that everything would be safe. But we already know that those procedures are never 100% complete. They never match perfectly the operating environment you're going to be in, because they can't. If they did, they would be this big and nobody would read them anyway. And it's questionable whether or not people know what's in their standards and their procedures anyway, unless they've had this sort of audits and checking that's going on. So we have this baseline, this understanding that as long as people are following those rules, then we'll be safe. But the reality is that actually we drift. We move around the situation. And this blue line shows what the real world looks like, that we initially start below that work as imagined line, because we've said it's never perfect. Those guidelines and things are never 100% right. So the operators, the divers, the instructors, the dive center managers, they take those guidelines and they start to deal with the conflicts, time, pressure, money, customers, all sorts of things, and people adapt. And what they're doing all the time is managing this drift. Because if they weren't managing it, then we'd have a lot more accidents than are out there. Now, we might have a fair few near misses and a lot more than are reported, but ultimately people are creating safety with the resources they've got and the pressures they're having to deal with. At the same time, we have people who go above and beyond. They innovate. What they're doing is better than that's listed in terms of work as imagined. They're coming up with novel ideas, novel solutions, and they're becoming more efficient. Now, depending on the organization you're in, that innovation might be punished as well, because you have to teach what's in the standards. Because if you don't, you open yourself up for litigation. Now, at the same time as divers, dive center managers, instructors, training organizations are managing that drift against the documentation, we also have things called accumulations. And that could be old equipment. It could be about changes in the weather. It could be about a typhoon coming in or a monsoon, or it could be, it could be about a change in staff that have happened. It could be about new legislation coming in that you have to adapt to what's going on. Now, the gap between the red line and the blue line is this capacity to fail safely. And anybody's seen a number of the presentations I've given, I have this phrase which comes from a colleague of mine, Todd Conklin, who talks about safety is not just the absence of accidents and incidents, but rather it is the presence of barriers and defenses and the capacity of the system to fail safely. So what we're doing is we're managing drift against the paperwork, but as operators, as divers, dive instructors, we're also managing the gap between hazards that are there and how we do it. Now, when those two lines cross, we've run out of capacity. We don't have any way of creating safety anymore. And that might be because we run out of time, we run out of money to pay for new maintenance, pay for new equipment. Or it could be that actually the goals that we were doing, and that could be about wreck exploration or cave exploration or a photo project or a video project, they erode those margins of safety until we end up with an accident. Now, normally what happens when this accident occurs is the spotlight is turned on that event. And they're looking at the deviations and the drift between the blue line and the white dotted line, the work is imagined and work is done line. So we have this gap. But they're also looking at all of the things that have gone wrong within the dive center, about maintenance of equipment or the diver themselves. Have they had their equipment serviced? When was the last time it was tested? When was the last time they had some training? That the spotlight turns immediately on them. But actually, if we created an environment where we could stop time 10 seconds before those lines crossed, we would have lots of learning available. So if we didn't have the accident, the environment, the context, the data, the examples of how people are managing drift would be available. And we'd also be able to see the accumulations that are happening within the system. What's wrong, what's eroded, but those all take time, and we don't see the value of them because often we're managing that risk, that normalization of risk. We haven't had something go wrong, therefore it must be okay. But when the spotlight is turned and the investigation happens, then we can see what happens. Now, accidents happen as deviations from, or when the capacity from normal work is exceeded. Not necessarily from deviations from the rules. Now, the rules in normal work might be the same, but often they're not. And this is one of the things that I often ask people to think about is, how does it make sense for people to do what they did? Because they're going to be managing those pressures, those tensions all the time. And then they run out of capacity. What was the trigger point that took them over that capacity? They've got a whole bunch of things that they're dealing with. So if we look at this in a slightly different way, if we think about work as imagined in the context of an effective and safe diver training system, and that is where we a system as a complete like human factor system. So we have something that takes into account the training agencies, the divers, the instructors, the instructor trainers, and the documentation that you're going to use, and the dive centers you're going to operate to. And you're going to be in nice water, you're going to be in cruddy water. It's poor visibility depending on where you are. But somebody who comes up with a training program in their head will think, this is what I think it should look like. And then what they do is they codify it. So we take work as imagined in my head, which works in multi-dimensions and time doesn't have a problem. Then I start to write this stuff down. There's a limit to what I can do in terms of writing things down. Because I have to be concise, I have to be accurate, I have to make sure that people understand what's being written. And then it's got to be of a manageable size as well. And I've got to be able to teach it to somebody else. So there's a whole bunch of reduction and simplification about what's going on. Somebody's just won the jackpot. So their idea of, that is prescribed is limited, is a subset of work is imagined, and it's going to be different. And then what happens is those training agencies, those organizations, dive center managers, whatever, they then give that document set to the divers and the instructors and say, make this happen. Now, depending on the culture you have and how things are, I could go up to a dive instructor and say, tell me how you do your job. How do you teach this class? And they're all going to be slightly different. And the major difference is going to be something called just culture and psychological safety. Because if it's not a sound environment, if it's not a safe environment, that instructor is going to tell me exactly as per the book how they do their job. And they'll say these are the student ratios and this is how we manage the time. And yes, we make sure that the students have the mastery and that they're going to execute their drills as they work, and they can be autonomous divers when they leave the class. But if I am in that training agency, I'm in that dive center, and I've created a psychologically safe environment where people can question and challenge and make mistakes, and they can talk about these things. If I've created that psychologically safe and a just culture environment, I say to that instructor, hey, John, how do you teach this class? What are the challenges you face? What is it that I can do to help you? And he went, you know what? It sucks. Because the standards say that I can take 4 divers here, and the students expect me to take 4 divers. But the limited visibility means that actually I should only probably take 1 or 2 divers, or I need some additional assistance. I need an instructor, assistant instructor, or a dive master to help me manage the risks that are going on. And that is the difference between work as imagined and work as done. And we have to expose that. Now, to close that gap, if I go back to this graph here, the goal of finding out the gap between work as imagined and work as done isn't to force people to align to the standards. It could be that we change the standards to be more it's easier to follow, and that's one of the key tenets of human factors. Is it's making it easier to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong thing. And if you can collect the stories from your divers, your instructors, your instructor trainers, your dive centers, you can find out the gaps that they're having to deal with between work as done and work as imagined. What you could probably do is raise that dotted line, and you could raise the bar against what is needed, and you can focus on the good things that are out there. So that's my normalization of deviance, normalization of risk, and work as imagined and work as done. Now, I don't know whether or not there's any questions. We're in a different system at the moment, so I can't see if there's any feedback. But Nora, are there any questions or comments from the social media feeds? And if so, happy to answer them now. Otherwise, I'm happy to turn it over to the pre-recorded stuff of N to Z.
No, we don't have any question at the moment.
Okay, that's fine. So if you want to get hold of me, thehumandiver.com is my website. If you want to look at the recordings from the Human Factors in Diving Conference, they're available. Oh, go on, Nora.
Yes, I would like to look at that.
Okay, yeah, that's cool. So the website for that, I'll forward the link, but if anybody's listening, it's hf-in-diving-conference.com, and you can see them there. So Nora, thank you very much for again inviting me onto this. I'm always passionate about sharing my knowledge. If anybody else is in a club or wants me to give a presentation, more than happy to do so. Just drop me a line via the contact page. And if you want to have something in a more sensible time zone, I have instructors dotted around the world as well who are able to help you with that and be more local in terms of times. So once again, thanks very much, and we will see you the next time around. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Gareth. And once again, we always look forward to having a session with you where you can share with us a little bit more information on what it is that matters as a diver. You know what I mean? I think I will give it over to Al Franz to continue with the presentation. But everybody that is tuning in, please do stay tuned for the next session, which is our last session, and it's going to be talking about the epic journey of recycled marine plastic with our ocean hero called Rob Thompson. He's from UK, and he's fronting Odyssey Innovation Limited. Of course, with that particular session, we'll be joined by Sweetania Puspalastari, which is the Executive Director of Divers Clean Action, and also Matilda De Silva, founder of Ocean Purpose Project as well. And that will happen around 9:30 p.m. So once again, Gareth, thank you so much. Enjoy your freedom that you don't have to, stay at home. You can roam around
Exactly.
a little bit more.
I can go diving, which is most important. I can now get in the water and have, managing my risk, which is what it's about. So thank you very much, Nora. Take care.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Not So Sunny Vancouver Island. I'm Guy from the Human Diver team, and today we're continuing our letters A to Z of human factors. Today's letter is N for normalization of deviance, normalization of deviation. This is a term that was coined by Diane Vaughan in her work on the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. So what do we mean by normalization of deviation? Well, what I thought I'd do is come down to the floating dock here in the bay, and I thought I'd give you an example. When I decided to come down here, I stood about 10 feet or so from the edge of the dock, because if a boat came in, the dock floats, and the dock could get a little bit tippy, and I could fall off into 30 feet of water. So I didn't want to do that. So I made sure that where I stood was someplace relatively safe. Well, no boats came in. All right, so that's pretty good. So I started to move back a little closer to the edge of the dock so that I could get a better picture, and you wouldn't see the dock in the frame. And still no boats came in. Well, I move a little closer, and now pretty soon I'm standing right on the edge of the dock, and nothing bad has happened, so I haven't corrected my behavior. Even though I knew when I came down here that my risk analysis said don't get too close to the edge, I gradually became from that perspective, a little bit more risky as I stood towards the edge, because nothing had happened to change my mind or to prove that it was a bad idea to stand close to the edge of the dock, until a boat would come along and the dock would get tippy and I probably would fall in because I was standing around the edge of the dock. So that's how it happens. It's a series of events that cause us to move closer and closer to something that we identify as risky behavior, but because we don't get the feedback of having the result of a bad decision, we never actually realize that we've deviated so far, and we've normalized that deviation. It happens in corporate culture, happens in safety all the time. So as a diver, then, you want to be careful that when we sit in a dry room and we decide what's safe and what's okay to do, that we want to make sure that we don't allow ourselves to drift from that standard over time because we don't have something bad happen to correct us. All right, so be safe, have great dives, watch out for normalization of deviation because it catches us all. Okay, have a great day.
Welcome to the next instalment of A to Z of Human Factors. And what we're going to look at for today is O for outcomes. And, outcomes are easy to focus on because they are in front of us. We can see when somebody has had an uncontrolled buoyant ascent, or they've run out of gas, or they've entangled. We can see that there. So that's what we focus on. But what we should be looking at is actually that they are multifactorial. Outcomes are a function of a number of things that come together. And this framework is something that's based on a paper that I co-wrote for a surgical journal, in which we look at outcomes being a function of technical skills. And that's where lots of emphasis comes on buoyancy, propulsion, trim, videography, photography, putting an SMB up. Those are the technical skills that we acquire during our training courses. But we also identified that outcomes are also a function of context. And that could be the operating environment, how well the task has been designed, taking into account human performance. It could be about the social environment and the equipment that we're using. Then we look at randomness compared to luck. And in this case, randomness is what the wider community or population is exposed to. And in the case of diving, it could be that we look at PFOs. 25% of the population are believed to have a PFO. But we wouldn't know whether or not we've got one until something has happened or we've been tested. So we could be potentially unlucky that something has happened. So in this case, we're now going to look at also non-technical skills. And in this, what we're looking at is decision-making, communications, teamwork, leadership, and understanding these performance-shaping factors. And these four different layers are not just additive in nature, they're multiplicatory. So you could have awesome technical skills, it's a great dive, luck is on your side, but we've missed some briefing, so communications failed, that means our decision-making isn't sound, and we end up with an uncontrolled event where somebody ends up being injured. And it's because these are all contributing together that we can see quite easily as an outcome that something went wrong. We need to dig deeper into these to understand those contributions. Don't just focus on the technical skills, we also need to look at the context and develop these non-technical skills, which is what the programs are all about. So O in this case is for outcomes being a function of technical skill, context, randomness or luck, and non-technical skills. Thanks very much.
Morning, friends. I'm Guy from the Human Diver team. Today, we are continuing our Human Factors letters A to Z, and today is brought to us by the letter P for performance. Now, if you remember choosing teammates for a pickup team in school, in grade school, for example, you have two captains and you get to pick and choose from the rest of the room and you alternate choices. Invariably, I recall you pick the best players because you want to have the best teams. You pick the most high-performing people. But when we get a little bit older and we start to get a little bit more sophisticated, this isn't always the case that you might want to pick the best player. Simon, in terms of performance, Simon Sinek did some really great work with the U.S. Navy SEALs, and he put his discussion with the SEALs on a trust versus performance graph. And you can take a look at this right here. I've got on the wall behind me. Basically, they looked at the level of trust versus the level of performance, and the results might be a little bit surprising. It was more important, actually, that trust was at a higher level than performance. So the question was, I may trust you with my life, but would I trust you with my wife? And a little bit humorous, but it sets the tone. It's clear that you might take a high-performing, high-trust person. That seems pretty obvious. It's also fairly obvious that you might not pick a low-performing, low-trust team player, although in the case of the Navy SEALs, low performance is kind of relative. But what's interesting is that high-performance, low-trust people were not chosen very frequently. Whereas if you had to pick between high performance or high trust, you would choose high trust because you could train performance. You could train someone to become better at the skill. So ask yourself then the next question when you go to choose your dive teammates, if you're going to pick high performance or high trust, great buoyancy, great trim, or somebody's going to be there to help you in the event that everything goes non-linear. I know personally, I hope that my teammates know that I'm going to be there for them come thick or thin. I might not be the best diver in the water, but they can rest assured that I'm going to be the last person there to help them if they have a problem. All right, so have a great day, safe diving. Make sure you're there with trust.
Welcome to the next section in the A to Z of human factors in diving, and today is a very special day because it's when If Only, the film, is going to be released this evening in about 2.5 hours time. And the cue that we're going to talk about today is questioning attitude. It's that ability to look at something and say, I'm not quite right about this, I'm not quite sure. It's about approaching all those situations with a healthy unease. It's about recognizing that things can go wrong and things might not be going right. So how do we look at these things? How do we ask those curious questions? Being able to raise a concern before we start an activity, before we're committed to it. And you'll see from the film that there were numerous occasions when this happened, but the social pressures and the lack of psychological safety prevents that from happening. It's that ability to question unsafe behaviours or situations and sort of raise your hand and say, you know what, this doesn't look right. How do we validate that? How do we make sure that what we're doing is the right thing? And that's really difficult in a recreational activity where we are managing risks or uncertainties ourselves. And we're heavily influenced by biases. When things haven't gone wrong in the past, well, it probably means they're not going to go wrong in the future. So try to change that. Continually look at the dive, review it as we're going through the plan, before we get in the water, even when we're in the water, with that continual thing saying, is this the right thing to be doing? Constantly questioning. It's not about paranoia, it's about having a healthy unease. So Q is for questioning attitude, and I hope to see you in about 2.5 hours when If Only is premiered. If you'd like to know more, come and visit humandiver.com/info. And there's an error. humandiver.com/if only. Thanks very much. Good morning, and to the next edition of the A to Z in human factors in diving. And today we're going to talk about R for reflection. Reflection is that ability to look at an image or an account and understand what's in front of us or what happened in the past. And if we're going to learn and get better, it is that reflection on the past that is really important. The premiere of If Only was released yesterday, and in it we can look at these things and say, yeah, Brian made some mistakes, the team made the mistakes, the instructor made the mistakes. Let's reflect and say, how many of those similar or same mistakes have we made ourselves? In fact, 2 weeks before Brian had got in on that dive on the 20th of May 2018, 2 weeks beforehand, he made almost exactly the same mistake, but appears not to have been picked up. Fortunately, at that stage, his oxygen was turned on and the rebreather kicked into life at 1.5 meters, as it was supposed to. So one of the real key things here is not just about why did somebody do something. It is much more important to look at how it made sense. If you're going to ask a why question, look at why does the system behave the way it does? Why do training organizations, why are they structured the way they are? Why is it that instructors teach others in the way they do? Because it is by looking at the system properties that we are more likely to improve safety in the future. We can look at reflection on ourselves and our own activity, but also if we want to create genuine change, let's look at the wider pieces. So R is for reflection. Thank you. Welcome to another day in the A to Z of human factors in diving. And today we're going to talk about S for surprises. And this quote comes from a friend of mine, Duncan McKillop, who talks about if there were no surprises, there wouldn't be accidents. And that seems like quite an obvious statement. But if we think about why those accidents happen or those incidents happen, it's because we weren't expecting something to happen. Our attention was maybe drawn away to somewhere or something else, something that we think was more important than what we're looking at. And in fact, one of the discussions I had with an Italian trainer this morning, talking about, is there something that is really key when it comes to improving safety? And I would say it's another S, and that's about situation awareness, this understanding of what's happening now and what's going to happen in the future. And all of these sort of skills that we're talking about in terms of communication and teamwork and leadership, they all help build this mental model about what's happening now, this approximation of what's happening now, and more importantly, what's going to happen in the future. By the ability to tell stories about things that have surprised us, we can help inform other people what's going to be a potential surprise. And the hardest part for that is getting over the bias that says, well, I haven't been surprised by that, therefore it doesn't exist, or it doesn't exist for me. And that is an attitude that we need to change. Our brains are all broadly wired the same way. We perceive information, we process it, and we project into the future. And the better prepared we are, the less likely we are to be surprised. Because when we're surprised, our brains take a mental shortcut, we disengage the logical part of our brain, and we employ emotions or fight and flight. And at that stage, we are going back to pure training that we've experienced in the past. And if we've not encountered that before, then we're likely to end up with an adverse outcome. So today, S is about surprises and trying not to have them by improving situation awareness. If you'd like to know more about what we do, visit thehumandiver.com. So welcome to the next installment of the A to Z of human factors in diving, and today we're going to talk about T for trust, something that we would really like to have and that we would like to be able to create for other people too. And one of the challenges is trying to get that across to people. What do you mean by trust? And I recently came across a research paper by a guy called Shane Snow, who identified sort of three areas, three levels of trust. And we've got some foundation, the middle area, and the top part, and that sort of superficial area. And he said, well, when we're looking at the top level, which is ability, that's, how smart we are, how competent we are. We demonstrate it by the skills, how we deal with uncertainty, and how do we deal with the mistakes we make. When those things get broken, we break that, we can build it relatively quickly. We can demonstrate that, we made a mistake, we can rebuild that. The next level down was integrity, and that is about how aligned are our words with our actions. Do we walk the talk? And in this case here, we're talking about sharing of information transparently. It's about delivering on what you say you're going to do, and it's about playing fair. And in this case, if integrity is broken, it's a bit harder to rebuild, because we've also got to potentially look at the higher levels as well. And then finally, he talks about the foundations. and he talks about this as being made up of benevolence. How much do you have other people's interests at your heart? And, are you actively listening when people are talking to you? Are you willing to be vulnerable and show your own weaknesses so that you can help other people? Is it an ability to sacrifice your time, your capability to help somebody else? And it's building further on this playing fair. It's about taking care of people, not taking advantage of them. And, these three floors, this pillar of three floors, is held in place by consistency. And as long as we're consistent, then we can provide this stability. So I'm going to write a blog on this a little bit time, but trust, what Shane Snow was talking about, are these three levels. The foundations on benevolence, the next floor is integrity, and the top floor is ability. And if we know that people don't have our interests at heart and they're exploiting us potentially for money in terms of diver training, then actually the trust disappears. And that's not just at an individual level, it's also at an organizational level. So T is for trust in the A to Z of human factors in diving. Thank you. So today's A to Z in human factors in diving is U for uncertainty. And in this, what we're going to look at is risk with a slightly different view. Risk is this probability times consequence. Now, the difficulty when we're in diving, we talk about, let's do a risk assessment. Okay, can you tell me what the probability of running out of gas is? What about the probability of an entanglement or a separation? Or any of these risks or these hazards that we're trying to deal with. Actually, what we're doing when we come plan for a dive and execute a dive is we're managing uncertainties. And uncertainties are managed through emotions, not logic. That if something has happened recently, we think it's more likely to happen. If something serious has happened to us, we'll pay more attention to it. But if somebody else encounters that situation and they've never really thought about it, the hazard is still there, but they don't take that same thought process that's going on. So what we need to do to be able to manage uncertainty is reduce it. And that means that we get a better idea of how things are likely to happen or not, as the case may be. We can do that with a dive brief that covers what we're planning on doing, but also the boundaries and, importantly, what the contingencies are. What happens if we do have a separation or entanglement or visibility is reduced? We do the dive and then we have a debrief. And what that does is it closes the gap between what we should have done and what we actually did. And that helps us gain better certainty for the next dive. We're still going to be using mental shortcuts and these cognitive biases, but they're likely to be better informed. So U is for uncertainty in the A to Z of human factors in diving. Hope you're having a great weekend. Speak to you soon.
Hi, it's Helen. We continue with the A to Z series of human factors in diving with the letter V. V for verification. Why should we verify anything prior to a dive? Because humans make mistakes. We all make mistakes, errors, lapses, slips. It is normal. Most of the time, these errors don't have any serious consequences. But when we're just about to perform an action with a potential of dangerosity, we need to verify ourselves to prevent the errors from occurring. Look at these guys. Before coming to fill their tanks, they came over twice to verify themselves, to make sure everything is alright before doing that risky procedure. The same thing goes for divers. We should do a pre-dive check to help us to prevent errors from occurring. We have a lot of tools that we can use, and checklists are one of them. Pilots use checklists all of the time. A good checklist should be short and concise, doesn't take long to complete, and goes over all critical points to ensure a safe dive. A checklist should be performed prior to every dive. It should be part of our routine. We should do it always in the same order with our dive buddy. If we decide to do it by ourselves, we should have it written down and we should follow what's written. The idea is to verify, to check ourselves, and not to rely on our memory. Another trick to help us to avoid missing steps and to confirm the check is to point, touch, and verbalize. This is especially effective for the equipment check. You point and touch your SPG and you verbalize the pressure on it. All of this will help you to focus because it will coordinate all your senses together. Diving, it's a lot of fun, but the risk of a critical incident following a small mishap is high because underwater, if you don't have air, you cannot survive. So pre-dive checks are very important. Don't trust yourself or anyone else, and always verify yourself prior to a dive. Stay safe and have a nice day.
Welcome to the next instalment of the A to Z of human factors in diving, and today the letter is W. And what we're going to talk about today in the next couple of minutes or so is work as imagined versus work as done. And this concept comes from the high-risk safety industries, where they've recognized that the stuff that we write down in the rules, the procedures, the processes, how people think certain jobs should be done is called work as imagined. And in this case, it is everything that is documented. The problem with that documentation and that work as imagined is often it is developed and written by people who are dislocated from the real world. What pressures that people are under, the time pressures, the financial pressures, the social pressures, and so they write a purist form of what should happen. And in the diving industry, there is a lot of litigation involved as well. So there has to be a lot of defensive writing going on. That means that if something isn't done right, it can be held, divers, instructors can be held accountable to what should have been done. But in the real world, what happens is that documentation, those procedures, those ideas get taken and then they meet the real world. And it becomes very difficult to manage the reality of the situation with the rules that are going on and the pressures that are on. And what we've seen recently with the documentary If Only, there's commercial pressures, the time pressures that mean that people don't do what they're supposed to do. This gap between work as imagined and work as done happens everywhere. And so what we should be looking at is when accidents or incidents happen, don't just look at work as imagined, what should have been done in terms of the rules and regulations and procedures. Look at work as done, what happens normally, because accidents normally happen as deviations from work as done, not just work as imagined. So consider two entities: work as imagined, what should happen; work as done, what really gets done, and try to close that gap. That isn't about making everything go this way, it might be about changing some of the work as imagined to be closer to work as done. So W, work as imagined versus work as done. Thanks very much.
Greetings, friends. Welcome back to Human Factors A to Z. And today is brought to us by the letter X for unexpected. So what I'd like to talk about is how we can protect ourselves when we have unexpected things happen. Now, we can plan perfectly, and we can put a whole bunch of barriers in place to keep us safe, but everything that we do is created by man, and nothing is completely foolproof. So what we could do is if this is the incident that couldn't happen, we can put barriers here to protect us. So say we are driving a car down the freeway, I could put speed limits, I could put driver training, I could put a bumper, I could put an airbag, I could put all those things in place, but none of them are foolproof, none of them are perfect. So we still have to take a look at the other side of the incident and assume that we want to fail safely. We want to protect ourselves in the event that there's failure, given that it's potentially possible, right? So what then we need to look at is the after side of this incident. So what do we do here? So let's just switch this over for a second and talk about diving. So if this is gas planning, one of our barriers is training, a teammate, a whole protocol, following standardized protocol, etc. On this side, well, what happens if we still have an incident? Well, we could have proper EMS training. We could have oxygen equipment on the boat. We could have a dive plan that involves the skipper. We could have Dan on speed dial. We could have EMS on speed dial, etc. So what we're doing is we're protecting ourselves at the front end with barriers and etc. to hope that an incident doesn't happen, but it's going to happen at some point when all the little pieces of Swiss cheese line up and the failure or the incident happens. So we need to also look at how we can fail safely. So today, for the letter X, for unexpected, let's think about failing safely. Okay, thank you. Greetings, friends. Welcome back to Human Factors Letters A to Z. And today is brought to you by the letter Y. And Y stands for you. At the end of the day, you are in control of your destiny when it comes to your approach to non-technical skills and human factors. You get to decide what kind of leader or follower you want to be. You get to decide whether you want to reflect on your performance to learn. You get to decide how important it is to pay attention to drift. You get to decide whether you want to adopt a fail safely model like we discussed earlier. You get to decide whether a proper debrief is important or not. You get to decide whether you want to do verification of your equipment before you go diving. You can change your teammates. You can change your environment. You can change your equipment. You can change the time of day. You can change pretty much everything in your diving, but the one thing that will remain constant will be the fact that you're diving with you. So it stands to reason that you would pay attention to that commonality in your diving. And that's where human factors and non-technical skills come in. I'd like to paraphrase, this is my final opportunity to, in the alphabet, I'd like to paraphrase one of my favorite poems. I'm going to change it a little bit so it's a little bit more applicable. But it matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. You are the master of your fate, and you are the captain of your soul. So thank you very much for listening, and incorporate human factors in your diving to make yourself have happier and safer dives. And thank you very much for listening. Have a great night.
Welcome to the final of 26 short videos on the A to Z of human factors in diving. And in this one, it's a bit of tongue-in-cheek. And what we're talking about here is Z is for Zulu and not zebra. And the idea here is that actually there are specific ways of communicating messages, especially letters, so that they are not misunderstood. The standard phonetic alphabet means that when we say letters like alpha for A and B for Bravo, that gets the message across. And what I'm hoped, and the team has hoped, is that over the last 25 days, we've given you some ideas about what human factors in diving means. It could be about debriefing. It could be about understanding the difference between work as imagined and work as done, or expect the unexpected. All of these are contributory towards effective human factors, better decision making, better awareness, better communication, better leadership, and better teamwork, and understanding how all of those contribute. So what I'm going to make available is a product. Anybody who's signed up for the mailing list for the Human Diver will get access to a product in the back end which has all 26 of these videos so that you can refer back to them, because Facebook is not a great archive. They'll remain in this Facebook group, but they'll also be in the back end of the Human Diver. So thank you very much for the last 4.5 weeks of, or nearly 4 weeks of engagement and the comments and sharing. You know where we are. If you've got any human factors and diving questions, please post them in this group. Thanks very much for all of your time.